There we go. All right, we are in 1 Kings chapter 4 this morning. And we started this chapter on Thursday. It's focused around the organization of Solomon's empire. And the first passage that we read on Thursday has to do with Solomon's administration. So we've got the first 6 verses that talk about all of the high officials of the land. And one thing that I asked us to kind of stow away in the backs of our minds, and now I'm going to relieve all of our minds and stow this information on the chalkboard, is that the last high official that's named in verse 6, Adoniram, the son of Abda, was in charge of the forced labor. So we're going to come back to that. Besides hearing about him again in chapter 5, we've also got more to say about him and this position in this chapter. Then we looked at this essentially a taxation scheme. And I mean scheme in the non-derogatory sense. You know, scheme can be a neutral word just to talk about any kind of system that is set up for the administration of something. There are 12 officials who are responsible for providing for the king's household. They take it in turns month after month. And the way the text lists them, it makes it clear that they are in charge of particular districts and that they are collecting this provision from these districts. And these districts are not just the 12 tribes. One thing that it just occurred to me this morning, this list that we get in verses 7 through 19 might remind us of those lists in Joshua that set up the boundaries for the tribes, where you get all of these villages and towns that are listed around the edges of each tribe's border to make it clear, you know, where each tribe is at on the map. This section is doing something similar, except that these borders that are being set up are not the traditional tribal borders. This is something new. This is an innovation, we might say, specifically to provide for the king's household. Later on in our reading, we will see what that provision is, like how much these people have to provide. So we're ready to start now with verse 21. And I should note before we start that in verse 20 we learn at the end of all of that Judah and Israel were as many as the sand by the sea. They ate and drank and were happy. So again, not normally what you read after talking about taxation, but we'll come to that in just a minute. So let's start with verse 21. Solomon ruled over all the kingdoms from the Euphrates to the land of the Philistines and to the border of Egypt. They brought tribute and served Solomon all the days of his life. Solomon's provision for one day was 30 cores of fine flour, 60 cores of meal, 10 fat oxen, 20 pasture-fed cattle, 100 sheep, besides deer, gazelles, roebucks, and fattened fowl. For he had dominion over all the region west of the Euphrates, from Tiphsah to Gaza, over all the kings west of the Euphrates. And he had peace on all sides around him. And Judah and Israel lived in safety from Dan even to Beersheba, every man under his vine and under his fig tree, all the days of Solomon. Solomon also had 40,000 stalls of horses for his chariots and 12,000 horsemen. And those officers supplied provisions for King Solomon and for all who came to King Solomon's table, each one in his month. They let nothing be lacking. Barley also, and straw for the horses, and swift steeds they brought to the place where it was required, each according to his duty. All right, let's pray together. Righteous Heavenly Father, thank you for blessing us by preserving this word concerning your servant, the King Solomon. We pray, Father, that you will be with us as we consider these words and help us, Father, to discern their meaning and importance for us. We thank you, Father, that you have blessed us so greatly with the gifts of your Son, that you granted us his life and the hope of his new life. It's in his name that we pray. Amen. All right, so we get the extent of Solomon's empire here, which stretches from the Euphrates, and your translation might just say the river, but in Hebrew, the river is always the Euphrates. Every other river, the text will specify which river it is. If you ever see in Hebrew a reference to just the river, it's the Euphrates. So it stretches from the Euphrates down to the territory of the Philistines and to Egypt. We should remember, by the way, that the Euphrates, we typically think of the Euphrates like down, closer to the sea down here. The Euphrates reaches all the way up here. And this particular section of it is probably what the text is concerned with as a border for Solomon's kingdom. And his empire, I should say. So again, the kingdom of Israel, and even the text even still refers to it this way. Judah and Israel lived in safety from Dan even to Beersheba. So what are the extents of the kingdom? Well, it's from Dan to Beersheba, the traditional area of Israel. That's the kingdom. But Solomon's empire extends far beyond that. And this is the greatest extent of Israel's power in history. I want us to look at this from a couple of angles. First off, this fulfills a promise, actually a series of promises, that God made to Abraham and to Israel. So if you turn to Genesis 15:18, this is the first big covenant offering that the Lord makes to Abram. Genesis 15:18, on that day the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, to your offspring I give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates, the land of the Kenites, the Kenizzites, the Cadmonites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Rephaim, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Girgashites, and the Jebusites. But that's what he's promising to Abraham, all of this stretch here. And he repeats this promise in Exodus 23:31. And I will set your border from the Red Sea to the Sea of the Philistines, from the wilderness to the Euphrates. For I will give the inhabitants of the land into your hand, and you shall drive them out before you. And finally, he repeats this promise in a few different places, but the last one I want to consider is just before Israel enters into the land, in Joshua 1, verse 4, from the wilderness and this Lebanon as far as the great river, the river Euphrates, all the land of the Hittites to the great sea toward the going down of the sun shall be your territory. All right, so all of this has been promised. But we should understand that, like the conquest, this is not what we might expect a complete fulfillment to look like. So by the end of Joshua, for example, in reading of the conquest, Israel goes in and they conquer the land, but by the time that Joshua is old and done, what's the state of the land? Has everyone been driven out? No. The land is still not conquered. And that persists all the way down through the period of the Judges, into the kingship of Saul, and even into the day of David. What city do we typically think of as like David's main capital city? Jerusalem. Right, but remember, his first capital wasn't Jerusalem, it was Hebron, because Jerusalem was still a Jebusite city in David's day. And so we're talking, the main capital city of Israel was still occupied by heathens into David's reign. And he went in and captured Jerusalem and killed all the Jebusites. And David's reign is the one where that job of conquest is basically finished. But here we're in a similar spot. All of this land has been promised to Israel, and it's all under the control of the king of Israel, but it's not Israel. There's not any Israelites living up in this section of the empire. Israel is, like the text says, from Dan to Beersheba. These other places, which this map has shaded blue, and for some reason they've stretched it all the way around over here, which I don't think is quite accurate. All of this area in blue here, those are other sovereign nations with their own rulers, like their own kings. It's just that they've been subjugated by Israel. They're what we would call vassal kingdoms, with Israel as their overlords. Israel has not driven anybody out of the land. They've not conquered the land. We should also remember, by the way, that Solomon is maintaining and strengthening an arrangement that David is ultimately responsible for. So if you go back to 2 Samuel chapter 8, we're going to read about David conquering all of this area. After this, David defeated the Philistines and subdued them, and David took Metheg-ammah out of the hand of the Philistines, and he defeated Moab, and he measured them with a line, making them lie down on the ground. 2 lines he measured to be put to death, and 1 full line to be spared. And the Moabites became servants to David and brought tribute, which of course should sound familiar, based on what we just read in 1 Kings 4. David also defeated Hadadezer, the son of Rehob, king of Zobah, and as he went to restore his power at the river Euphrates. So the Zobah area is up around here. David took from him 1,700 horsemen, 20,000 foot soldiers, and David hamstrung all the chariot horses, but left enough for 100 chariots. And when the Syrians of Damascus came to help Hadadezer, king of Zobah, David struck down 22,000 men of the Syrians. Then David put garrisons in Aram of Damascus, and the Syrians became servants of David and brought tribute. And the Lord gave victory to David wherever he went. And David took the shields of gold that were carried by the servants of Hadadezer and brought them to Jerusalem. And from Betah and from Berotai, cities of Hadadezer, King David took very much bronze. Let's see, do we have Damascus labeled on this map? I ought to have checked this beforehand. We've at least got Aleppo up here. And I think part of the confusion with this map is that they've taken Aram to mean over here, like where Abraham was originally from. The text is talking about Aram of Damascus, which is over here. But anyway, and we read furthermore, when Toi, king of Hamath, heard that David had defeated the whole army of Hadadezer, Toi sent his son Joram to King David to ask him about his health and to bless him, because he fought against Hadadezer and defeated him. For Hadadezer had often been at war with Toi. And Joram brought with him articles of silver, of gold, and of bronze. These also King David dedicated to the Lord, together with the silver and gold that he dedicated from all the nations he subdued, from Edom, Moab, the Ammonites, the Philistines, Amalek, and from the spoil of Hadadezer, the son of Rehob, king of Zobah. All right, and that covers basically all of this area. There's a little more reading we could do in 2 Samuel 10, but you get the point. David did all of this conquering and established this empire, and Solomon inherits it, and strengthens it and maintains it. And so just as David was collecting tribute from all of these people, so Solomon is also collecting tribute. Let's see. And so in this context, in 1 Kings 4, as the prophets are telling us about the extent of Solomon's empire, the prophets also tell us about Solomon's provision. And this ties both of these sections of chapter 4 together. The bit with the taxation districts, how Israel itself has been organized under Solomon, along together with Solomon's imperial holdings. Because Solomon's provision comes from both the people of Israel and from the tribute of these subjugated nations. And at this point in chapter 4, the text kind of weaves back and forth on these subjects, reminding us of his dominion in verse 24, then reminding us of the 12 districts in verse 27, and describing Solomon's provision in between. And you look at his provision. It is a pretty tremendous amount of food. His provision for one day was 30 cores of fine flour, 60 cores of meal, 10 fat oxen, 20 pasture-fed cattle, 100 sheep, besides deer, gazelles, roebucks, and fattened owl. Of course, Solomon isn't eating all of this himself. This is for the royal household, which not only includes the royal family, but also members of the court and their families. So a lot of these high officials that are named at the beginning of chapter 4, their families would be included in this, along with many other people who were provided for from the king's table. You might remember back in chapter 2, when David was on his deathbed, he told Solomon to continue providing for the sons of Barzillai from his table. The sons of Barzillai, more than likely, are not the only ones who enjoy this kind of arrangement with the throne. It was pretty typical in ancient times for ancient kings to support a lot of people, mainly people who were loyal to them. But we don't just read about food. What else do we read about, say, in verse 26? Solomon doesn't just get food from his empire. What else does he get? A lot of animals. Specifically, what kind of animals? Horses. Lots and lots of horses. And horsemen. Lots of people to ride on the horses. And, of course, barley and straw for all of the horses, as we read in the verses after that. And at this point, well, go ahead, Wayne.
Well, this goes to a lot of modern Christians tend to think that Israel was so poor in most of their most of their existence, that they walked everywhere they went.
Yeah.
And they have this in their mind that they're real poor, dilapidated people that walks all over the place. No, they had horses to ride on. They had mules to carry things with, camels to ride on. They had animals to get from one place to another. It wasn't the way that a lot of denominations want to depict it.
Yeah, and even in scarcer times, like the period of the Judges, you still read about some individuals, having, what was the judge's name? Yair, who had 70 sons who rode on 70 mules. You do have occasionally very, very wealthy men. Or we could note Boaz. Boaz was a pretty wealthy guy. So yeah, there were times in Israel's history where things were more scarce, but everybody's living high on the hog right now. Israel is rich. Not just Solomon, Israel is rich at this time. But as we consider the fact that Solomon had 40,000 stalls of horses for his chariots and 12,000 horsemen, Does that send up any red flags for y'all? Does that remind you of anything that we have read recently in the law of Moses? Yes, we're gonna come to that passage in just a minute, because that's the big one. That's the big one. I want to work our way up to that first. Dennis?
I believe it was stated that the king was not supposed to amass horses for himself.
Yes. If you turn to Deuteronomy 17, because we were just here last week, I think. Deuteronomy 17. Because remember, we were talking about, at the beginning of chapter 3, whenever Solomon made this marriage alliance with Pharaoh, king of Egypt, was he doing anything inappropriate in that? And one of the passages that we considered was this passage in Deuteronomy 17. We're going to start in verse 14. And we said at the time, in 1 Kings 3, that Solomon hadn't really directly or overtly disobeyed any of the commandments here, but I want us to consider it again. When you come to the land that the Lord your God is giving you, and you possess it and dwell in it, and then say, I will set a king over me like all the nations that are around me, you may indeed set a king over you whom the Lord your God will choose. One from among your brothers you shall set as king over you. You may not put a foreigner over you who is not your brother. Only he must not acquire many horses for himself, or cause the people to return to Egypt in order to acquire many horses, since the Lord has said to you, you shall never return that way again. And he shall not acquire many wives for himself, lest his heart turn away, nor shall he acquire for himself excessive silver and gold. And it's funny that the prophets are reminding us of this specific passage again in telling us about all of these horses that Solomon has. And it doesn't look good. But the prophets remind us again of how well everything is going in Israel during this time and how happy everybody is. We read at the end of verse 24, he had peace on all sides around him. And Judah and Israel lived in safety from Dan even to Beersheba, every man under his vine and under his fig tree, all the days of Solomon. So what are the prophets doing, telling us that everything is going super well in Israel? Everybody's rich, everybody's safe, everybody's happy. And then turning around and telling us about all of these horses that Solomon has gotten for himself and reminding us of this passage about things the king isn't supposed to do. What do you think the prophets are getting at with some of this? Jason?
I think we're seeing a little bit of foreshadowing here where we're kind of planting a seed from the beginning. We see that, the scriptures are talking about the things that he's doing that he's supposed to do, and he's being well led and counseling the Lord for wisdom.
Yep.
But also, we have this thing creeping up in the background where he's starting, don't take many wives. I wonder why we're going to talk about that, why that was not said to be done. Don't take many horses. Yep. So you see, this is kind of like, this is the beginning almost of the end, where you see these few verses start to creep up. And I think that should teach us a lesson as well, is even a little leaven leaveneth the whole lump. To allow ourselves to even transgress God's law a little bit, in his wisdom he has said, this will lead you down the wrong path. If and we're not careful. Even if you are careful, it probably still will. Just because that's the nature of our fleshly desires, is to store ourselves up and say how great we are and the things that we have. And at this time, if you were a warring man or a warring nation, probably the single greatest resource you could get for yourself would be horses and chariots. At this time, a huge army of horses and chariots would just mow down any competition on the field. And then you would start to rely on that, and you see how those things begin to creep. Look at how powerful we are. Look at how much we have. Look at how much I've amassed.
Yep.
And soon that will be the very problem that we see creep up.
And yeah, we have foreshadowed the entire book of Kings right there. Go ahead, Wayne.
I don't know why, but that kind of sounds familiar.
Yeah. That rings some bells, doesn't it?
Yeah,
Things
it's
tend
kind
to
of like
rhyme, don't
what
they?
we're doing ourselves in the United States of America. You know, it kind of rings some bells there.
Yeah, and I want us to develop that a bit. Like, you know, what can we learn for ourselves? So on a personal level, like Jason was just saying, this is a great example about how sin gets started in taking over and dominating a Christian's life, right? Because you start out resisting temptations, but once you give in to a temptation and make the choice to sin, but what happens after that? Does it get easier or harder to resist? Does it get easier or harder to sin? I know we're stating it in two different directions. It gets a lot easier to sin after that. It gets a lot harder to resist after that. Sin gets a little foothold in you, and then it starts taking more and more territory. But there's also some social commentary that we're going to get from this in just a minute. We're going to consider another couple of passages before we do that. Go ahead, Wayne.
Bad habits are like a warm bed on a cold winter's night.
Yeah.
Easy to get into and hard to get out of.
Yep, that is the truth. Okay, so the prophets are inviting us to understand the situation in Israel on two different levels. And Jason has described this already in some ways, that there's, I don't know, one thing I think it's helpful to remember is that two things can be true at the same time. Has Solomon so far in his reign been a faithful and just king? Yeah, I think the prophets have made that pretty clear to us. They've come right out and told us God was really pleased with Solomon's request for wisdom. And we're gonna get another passage right after this talking about how God is blessing Solomon. And it's God behind this. That is true. At the same time, what else is also true? That things are developing in Israel that are ultimately going to lead to destruction. So on a superficial level, everything seems to be going really well. Everybody's really happy with the way Solomon is doing things because, again, everybody's at peace. Everybody is relatively wealthy. And again, the prophets keep telling us this, like in verse 20, Judah and Israel were as many as the sand by the sea. They ate and drank and were happy. But particularly in bringing up the horses in the way that they have, the prophets are inviting us to take a hard look at this facade and to discern what's underneath it, what's waiting to surface. And this is the second level at which we're to understand the situation in Israel. So I want us to just briefly summarize what we have learned in this chapter. That Solomon has amassed many thousands of horses. We'll go ahead and add that to our list now. He has thousands of horsemen to ride them. The king's provision is so expensive that the entire nation has to take it in turns to make sure that his table is set. The taxation of the people is administered by this new district order that is different from the old tribal allotments. And all of this is overseen by the most complex bureaucracy that we have yet seen among the monarchs of Israel. Let's consider this. You think back, I mean, we've only got 3 monarchs to look at here, but consider Saul and consider David. Can you name any of King Saul's high officials? There's one who was really famous, who got murdered, whose name you ought to remember. Do you remember Saul's main general? Murdered by Joab. You know who I'm talking about, but you just don't remember his name. Abner. Great country name, Abner. other than that, we assume that Saul had some kind of administration, but it really was not very complex at all. David had Joab. He had the mighty men, who basically acted as like a personal guard. They weren't really administrators. He had counselors like Ahithophel before he turned traitor, Abishai, and there were some others. David's administration was a little more expansive than Saul's. Well, now you get to Solomon, and you've got Azariah as the priest, Ahillereph and Ahijah, the secretaries, Jehoshaphat, the recorder, Benaiah, commander of the army, Zadok and Abiathar, priests. Azariah was over the officers. Zabud was priest and king's friend. Abishar in charge of the palace. And Adoniram in charge of the forced labor. And, of course, that brings us to the next thing that we need to remember, that he has a guy who is in charge of forced labor over the entire kingdom, or the entire empire. And of course, what are we talking about when we're talking about forced labor? We're talking about slavery. And no matter how happy everyone seems in Israel, all of these facts should put us ill at ease, especially when we remember the words of Samuel the prophet. And Wayne remembered them right away. You go back to 1 Samuel chapter 8. And I want us to listen closely as we read this passage and consider how many of these things we have just heard described in this very happy Israel where everything is going oh so well. Either things mentioned specifically or generally. All right, 1 Samuel 8, verse 10. So Samuel told all the words of the Lord to the people who were asking for a king from him. He said, "These will be the ways of the king who will reign over you. He will take your sons and appoint them to his chariots and to be his horsemen and to run before his chariots." All right, just right out of the gate. "And he will appoint for himself commanders of thousands and commanders of 50s, and some to plow his ground and to reap his harvest, and to make his implements of war and to the equipment of his chariots. He will take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. He will take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive orchards and give them to his servants. He will take the tenth of your grain and of your vineyards and give it to his officers and to his servants. He will take your male servants and female servants and the best of your young men and your donkeys and put them to his work. He will take a tenth of your flocks, and you shall be his slaves. And in that day you will cry out because of your king whom you have chosen for yourselves, but the Lord will not answer you in that day." All of it is among what we've just read in 1 Kings 4. Some of them we've not heard specifically, things like taking daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. But the general situation in Israel fits what Samuel has foretold here, like a hand in a glove. You've got the horses and the horsemen, you've got all of that provision month after month. Everything that the prophet Samuel warned Israel would happen has happened. The only thing that's left is the crying. And so, we're going to finish this morning by considering, all right, well, if all of this stuff is going on that Samuel said would cause the people to cry out, then why are the prophets in 1 Kings 4 telling us that everybody's happy? Like, what's going on? So let's start in verse 29 and read through the end of the chapter. "And God gave Solomon wisdom and understanding beyond measure, and breadth of mind like the sand of the seashore, so that Solomon's wisdom surpassed the wisdom of all the people of the east and all the wisdom of Egypt. For he was wiser than all other men, wiser than Ethan the Ezrahite, and Heman, and Calcol, and Darda, the sons of Mahol, and his fame was in all the surrounding nations. He also spoke 3,000 proverbs, and his songs were 1,005. He spoke of trees, from the cedar that is in Lebanon to the hyssop that grows out of the wall. He spoke also of beasts, and of birds, and of reptiles, and of fish. And people of all nations came to hear the wisdom of Solomon, and from all the kings of the earth who had heard of his wisdom. So this last passage here equips us to understand how it is that all of these oppressive systems that Samuel warned about can be in place in Israel, and yet the people still be happy. And it all comes down to, ultimately, to God's blessing. But it's done specifically through Solomon's wisdom. There's a word play that's worth our attention there in back in verse 21, that Solomon ruled over all the kingdoms from the Euphrates to the land of the Philistines and to the border of Egypt. They brought tribute and served Solomon all the days of his life. The word for rule in that verse is the same root as the word for proverb. Right? Our authors, the prophets in Hebrew, are making this word play to make it clear to us. How is it that Solomon is ruling? Well, he rules by wisdom. That's what it means to rule. And we should recall in the last chapter that Solomon worried that he was not equal to the task of ruling such a great people as Israel. He said in chapter 3, verse 7, "And now, O Lord my God, you have made your servant king in place of David my father, although I am but a little child. I do not know how to go out or come in. And your servant is in the midst of your people whom you have chosen, a great people, too many to be numbered or counted for multitude. Give your servant, therefore, an understanding mind to govern your people, that I may discern between good and evil. For who is able to govern this your great people?" And now, the Lord has blessed Solomon to be uniquely fit for the task of ruling a people as innumerable as the grains of sand on the seashore, because Solomon's mind is as expansive as the seashore, which we're told in verse 29. So just one second. And this also, again, gives us another angle on Solomon's empire, that all the people of all nations came to hear the wisdom of Solomon from all the kings of the earth who had heard of his wisdom. So Solomon is recognized on the world stage. He's highly respected. And so, of course, no one is going to challenge his control over his empire. And all of this because God gave Solomon wisdom and understanding beyond measure. Now, the prophets are going to show us later on what happens when a person of smaller mind inherits the systems that Solomon has put together in this chapter. Because Solomon's not going to be king forever. But these taxation systems that he put in place are going to outlive him. They're going to be passed down to someone who's not as wise as he is. All right, go ahead, Wayne.
I was looking for a special passage in Proverbs. It says here, and you read it, he also spoke 3,000 proverbs.
Yeah.
Okay? He wrote a lot of proverbs. One of those proverbs he wrote, okay, is in verse 21 of chapter 20. It says, "An inheritance came hastily at the beginning, will not be blessed in the end." It's kind of like he knew something was going to happen.
Oh boy, that is worth filing away for later, because if there's, I tell you what, if there's not something that describes Rehoboam, that's it. Jason.
To try to make another good application here is that you can see that even with all of the things the fleshly world can offer, no matter how much you amass up, and all of the wisdom that can fit inside of a man's brain, right? This is as much wisdom, it's exceeding, right? But it's still not the wisdom of God.
Yeah.
So you see, even with all of those things, we're still not really up to the task to do things on our own. No matter what you have. And I've been part of, I've probably fallen into this trap myself. If I just had a little bit more of this, I could focus more on this. If I just had a little
better.
If I just had a little bit more money, I could do my Bible study because I wouldn't have to worry about this. Or if I was just a little wiser, you know what I mean? I wouldn't make those mistakes. I wouldn't sin if I was just a little bit more this.
Yeah. So shoulda, woulda, coulda.
Yeah. No matter how much we amass, we cannot do these things on our own. No matter how much fleshly treasure we have or how much earthly wisdom you compile, you will never be fit enough to be in God's presence, to substitute for him, which is what an earthly king really is for Israel here.
Yeah.
So we're not up to the task no matter how much we have.
Exactly. All right. Last thing I want us to note from this is that, and I said that this does provide us some social commentary, I guess, for understanding things even in our own day and age. You know, nothing changes, as Solomon himself pointed out once. Everything stays the same. And it is not particularly hard to look at the world and see how unjust and oppressive systems like what Solomon put in place might kind of skate by for a little bit when there's shrewd leadership up at the top. But eventually, you know, the chickens come home to roost. Eventually, these systems will catch up with the nation and will end up destroying the nation. So, all right, thank you so much for your kind attention and your questions and comments this morning. And Lord willing, we will get into 1 Kings 5 on Thursday.